Before we start, some housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself during the inputs, and please be aware that the event is being recorded, and by participating, you consent to the recording. Please follow the chat for updates and also use it to post your questions. You can post your questions already during the inputs, and they will be taken up at the end of the webinar. And please note that this webinar is held in English today, but you are welcome to also post your questions and comments in Spanish. And during the discussion part, you can also react by using the raise hand feature. And please also indicate your name and organization when posting a question in the chat or when you speak. And please note that it is prohibited to use or also invite any artificial intelligence program to our events. Here's also a small disclaimer, since this webinar is organized by the Global Action Partnership for EPR, the views and opinions, however, of the experts expressed in the webinar do not reflect the positions of all core partners of GAP for EPR, nor of Prevent Waste Alliance members or official policy positions of the international organizations and governments involved. And I'll just give you, oh, sorry. I hope you can see now the right slide. Sorry, 1 second. Someone took over control. Sorry, 1 second. Noel, could you please assist and provide me with the rights? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, we are on slide 3 now. Just quickly introducing the Global Action Partnership for EPR. GIZ, WWF, and OECD have partnered to establish the Global Action Partnership for EPR, hosted by Prevent Waste Alliance, and the partnership also receives circular economy support from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and is also in close collaboration with UNEP on providing technical support to governments and PROs. And as you can see, we are working mainly on 3 pillars: the library, a help desk, and a community. So please check out our website that you can see also here on the bottom of this slide. And in today's webinar, we will focus on 2 recently published papers. The first one being Reducing Resource Extraction and Use, Producer Responsibility for the Circular Economy, published by Zero Waste Scotland together with its partners. And then the second one, New Aspects of EPR, Extending Producer Responsibility to Additional Product Groups and Challenges Throughout the Product Lifecycle, published by OECD. And after the presentations, we will hear reaction from our discussants, and afterwards we have time to answer some of your questions, so please put them in the chat. Moving on to slide 4 to present our first speaker, which is Jamie Fry, Government Policy Manager at Zero Waste Scotland. Jamie leads a team of policy analysts to provide technical support to Scottish Government for the full range of their circular economy policy works, including the Circular Economy Bill and Roadmap, single-use plastics, EPR, and food systems. He has worked extensively on the UK EPR schemes and led intervention design works for Scotland's forthcoming circular economy roadmap. Prior to this, he designed improved litter monitoring systems, supported local authority recycling service changes, and assisted with climate change mitigation projects across Scotland. Very warm welcome to you, Jamie, and please take the floor.
Thank you, Angelina, and thank you to the Global Action Partnership for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. Can I have the first slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to provide an overview of the report that we produced in partnership with a number of international organisations. So I'll set out the rationale for why we think some changes are needed, and then I'll set out the key changes that we would like to start discussing more broadly with people. The paper that we produced is very much a think piece. It's very much aimed at engaging with different audiences and discussing what the next generation of producer responsibility would look like. So, as Angelina said, I am the Government Policy Manager at Zero Waste Scotland, and as well as the range of activities that were described, I also have worked extensively on extended producer responsibility for packaging, waste electricals, batteries, end-of-life vehicles, and we've also looked at tyres and fishing gear as well. Can I have the next slide, please? And we provide direct technical policy support to Scottish Government as they try to accelerate and implement a circular economy for Scotland. We provide a range of expertise across a full range of environmental and circular economy and resource management topics for Scottish Government. Next slide, please. So the paper that I'm going to talk through, I mentioned it was an international partnership, and the partners are on screen there: Product Stewardship Institute, University of Delhi, Centre for Biological Diversity, and Arizona State University. We also had a representative from Marlborough District Council in New Zealand, and we had technical input from Eunomia Research and Consulting early on in the process as well. So this gave us a nice range of views on producer responsibility in different geographies, working in different policy landscapes. Next slide, please. The paper sets out the problems that we're really trying to solve by looking at a new approach to producer responsibility. And fundamentally, the problem is overconsumption of materials and resources globally, not equally across all areas, and there is a marked difference between global north and global south. But fundamentally, we're consuming too many goods and materials for the planet to be able to sustain us. And this is driving climate change. This is driving material pollution, biodiversity loss through material extraction, processing, and the sale and use and eventual disposal of goods. And there is a linked issue and growing issue in inequality, both within nations and between nations, that we expect producer responsibility to be able to contribute towards as well. Next slide, please. This diagram will be very familiar to everyone on the webinar, I suspect. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation's butterfly diagram. It's used so widely because it's very effective at communicating what we're trying to achieve with the circular economy. We want to reduce material flows. We want to maximize the lifespan of products and materials. We want to be able to bring materials back into use when they require repair or remanufacture. And this diagram does a very good job of demonstrating that recycling is that's a good thing when we recycle things, but there are a number of stages that we should be working through before we get to the stage of recycling something to bring it back into use. Next slide, please. Similarly, in Scotland, we are very concerned with planetary boundaries, and we're interested in understanding the range of different indicators to show us whether we are overshooting the planetary boundaries, and it's demonstrated very well in the donut economics diagram on screen just now that was developed by Kate Raworth. Next slide, please. Which brings us on to the role that we think producer responsibility can have as a means to address overconsumption by ensuring that materials have an inherent value. So they're seen less as a commodity and more something that has intrinsic value, and we aim to maximize the use of those and maximize the maximize the lifespan before moving to recycling and making sure that we use the recycled products as well. Next slide, please. So we're saying that we're proposing a new form of producer responsibility. That doesn't mean that EPR, as we think of it just now, does not have a huge amount of value, and it isn't an essential aspect to any policy mix. Extended producer responsibility has done a very good job in schemes across the world in making sure that there are responsible end-of-life waste management systems. EPR schemes have helped us move away from a residual and waste disposal viewpoint into one where we can capture more materials, recycle more materials, And increasingly over the last few years, we've seen more interest in reuse to extend product lifespans. EPR we see as being one of the fundamental policy interventions that we would expect to see to accompany waste management systems. However, EPR schemes typically have focused on recycling as the primary mechanism. Increasingly, they are starting to move beyond recycling, but fundamentally, these have been recycling focused with recycling targets. And recycling in isolation, we feel, is a poor measure for making sure that we are accelerating and implementing a circular economy. So we need to look further and we need to consider additional mechanisms that we can implement. Next slide, please. We also don't want to lose sight of the fact that producer responsibility has to align with a wider policy framework as well. So any one policy mechanism in isolation is not going to achieve a circular economy, and it's not going to support a just transition towards a circular economy. There's a need for us to consider a wide policy mix. And there are people from various nations on the call just now, and the various policy mixes will differ between different nations depending on geography, demographics, your starting point just now, and the interest in moving forward with things like extended producer responsibility. Next slide, please. And again, not to labour the point too much, there are a lot of effective features of producer responsibility schemes just now. And we see the proposal that I'll come on to in the next slide as being the mechanisms which are in place just now and the features which are in place just now provide a strong starting point for considering the next iteration and the next version or the next era of producer responsibility. So we already see responsibility placed on producers who have the greatest leverage to be able to implement change. We see many schemes providing industry with the flexibility to implement mechanisms which are efficient and effective. We see, again, at product level, interventions designed to target specific product challenges or sector challenges, and gathering of lots of important information to be able to understand the impacts and assess performance over time. As I mentioned previously, we are also seeing increasing interest in fee modulation to drive recyclability, but increasingly we're also seeing that for things like recycled content and reuse. Next slide, please. All of which provides a sound basis for thinking which mechanisms could we improve on and go further with in order to affect a circular economy and to start addressing the crises that we face worldwide in a more urgent way. So the first of the mechanisms that we are proposing is that we can reflect the true cost of products. There are a lot of impacts of the products and goods which are placed on the market which are external to the value of the good. So impacts on climate change, biodiversity loss, human toxicity, land use and particulate matter are all listed there. But those broader environmental and social impacts aren't included within the price of the product. We feel there's a need to have a mechanism that allows us to internalize those. Now, we are not saying that we think all products should bear the full true cost of environmental and social impacts as soon as it's placed on the shelf. Instead, we're suggesting that where producers fail to meet performance targets, that there is the ability to levy the full true cost of products. So effectively acting as a penalty. So you may still have an EPR scheme which has full net cost recovery, which allows local authorities or municipalities to be paid for waste collection services, for example. But where performance fails to meet required targets on a consistent basis, we think there is a need for a penalty basis to be able to come in, which is significant enough to drive change. Next slide, please. And the second proposal that we've made to stimulate discussion on what this next era of producer responsibility would look like is a virgin material reduction target. So we are proposing virgin material per product per year. And we think that this could be a useful mechanism of reducing the consumption of materials and goods. By using a target rather than stipulating any one mechanism, we think this gives producers the flexibility to be able to meet targets in the most efficient and effective way. So for example, if we're looking for producers to reduce virgin material per product per year, they may decide to remove some components of products. They may decide to remove products altogether and adopt service models. They may decide to lightweight, which is what we've seen with things like packaging previously. They may pursue greater recycled content. And for each of these, there are obviously costs and benefits to doing so, which work across an entire supply chain and across entire economies. But at least with those three, it gives a level of flexibility in how producers decide to meet the targets which are set. Similarly, they may decide to make products which are more durable, where there is a longer expected or guaranteed product lifespan. So rather than a product which lasts 1 year, perhaps it's guaranteed for 5 years, and you spread the material use over 5 years rather than 1 year, at which point you would have to get rid of it. Similarly, producers may decide to invest in repair and reuse facilities. They may decide to invest in reuse and refill markets. Ultimately, with proposing a target like virgin material reduction, we are concerned with the outcome, which is reducing the virgin material which is used and reducing the pressure on extraction and processing. Next slide, please. So we feel that this is a compelling suggestion which it could work for many product types to reduce virgin material use per item per year. There are obviously some challenges in terms of data availability to be able to evidence that. There are some challenges around how that would work for multiple products at any one time. But as a broader target, we think producers should have some level of flexibility to decide the most efficient and effective way for them to deliver on the required performance. Next slide, please. And one of the issues which potentially arises when we start to talk about reflecting the true cost of products, so potentially much higher charges on producers who fail to meet performance targets, is any potential cost pass-through to consumers. So we're stating here that we're aware that this is a potential challenge, and it's one that we would like to explore further. But we do have within the report the statement that the role of policy is to manage the transition to a situation where we're consuming fewer products. The products which we do consume are higher quality, they're more durable, they're in use for longer, and there is a consideration there that the most vulnerable people and those on lower incomes still have access to products which are high quality, durable, and affordable. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, we want this to work within a wider environmental framework as well. So the exact policy mix might differ for different areas, but we feel that the proposals that we've put forward for producer responsibility for the circular economy merit further discussion and debate, and that is largely what we're trying to do with this think piece and the international partnership. We're trying to stimulate debate on what the next iteration of producer responsibility might look like. Next slide, please. I think we've covered that one as well. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions. And as I said, this is a think piece to stimulate conversation. So we look forward to speaking with people in more detail and hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for providing this food for thought and also for sticking to the time. Great, thanks. Before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to welcome our second speaker of today, which is Friedhof Laubinger. He's environmental economist at the OECD Environment Directorate, and since joining the OECD in 2017, he worked on a number of projects related to waste management and the circular economy. And Fritz holds a master's degree in environmental economics and policy from the Institute of Sustainable Resources at University College London. And with us today is also Andrew Brown. He will support us in the discussion. He's the junior environmental policy analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thanks for joining today. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Fritz.
Thank you, Angelina, and good morning to the Americas. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. My name is Friedhof, and together with Andrew, we have been co-authoring this OECD paper on new aspects on extended producer responsibility. So just a brief word on the OECD. For those of you who don't know the OECD, it's an international organization. We have approximately 38 member countries. And our ambition is to provide policy guidance and to provide essentially recommendations to design better policies for better lives. In the Environment Directorate and on circular economy, we work quite a bit on extended producer responsibility. We have worked on this topic for about 30 years. I think the most comprehensive guidance documents or reports that we have brought out was in 2001 and 16. And in the past years, we have focused on some more specific aspects around EPR designs, on free riding of online sales, on fee modulation, on the interaction of mandatory EPR schemes with deposit refund systems. And now most recently, we've had an international workshop and the publication of our paper on new aspects, which I briefly present today. So just to put this into perspective, I mean, waste generation is increasing and is projected to further increase in the future. It's projected to nearly double by 2050. And of course, this increased in a business as usual scenario. And of course, this increased waste generation will have environmental impacts, but will also lead to costs of managing this waste. There is public ambition, therefore, to reduce or phase out landfilling, to increase material recovery, which is putting circular economy on the policy agenda. And with circular economy on the policy agendas, the EPR is also receiving increasing attention, the use of EPR in certain product groups. Next slide, please. So EPR in itself is not a new instrument. It has already been applied in quite some sectors, mostly in packaging, for vehicles, for tires, and for electronics. And it has also shown that it has led to quite some successes. So it has allowed to recover some of the costs and essentially establish funding to build up separate collection infrastructure, to increase material recovery in those sectors. And there's also some early evidence that it has led to some extent to design changes. So it has incentivized lightweighting, so essentially the design of lighter packaging products, for instance. But there's also some criticisms around EPR, that it has only insufficiently contributed to sustainable design, that it creates costs to the industry, and that essentially those costs from EPR fees are then passed on in product prices to the producers. Municipalities have criticized that it could also that the loss of control, so the loss of control over the waste stream, is an issue for them. And there's also some critical points around that it's only insufficiently strengthening the demand for secondary products. Next slide, please. But with those experiences in EPR and also the successes that it has shown in collecting more material and also increasing recovery rates whilst implementing the polluter pays principle, policymakers are now also considering to apply EPR to additional product groups, as well as to additional environmental impacts. So you see that there's regional EPR requirements emerging, especially in the EU. You have EPR requirements coming up for fishing gear and for cigarette butts. There's public ambition for increased separate collection of textiles and of food waste, for instance, and EPR is discussed to play a role there. It's also discussed to play a role in managing and the financing and the recovery of larger waste streams, such as for instance construction and demolition waste. There's then also discussion about enlarging the role of EPR to additional life cycle impacts. So traditionally, EPR is mostly focusing on the end of life, and it's mostly measured on recycling rate performance, as we've already heard from Jamie. But there's increased ambition to enlarge the scope of EPR and essentially the responsibility that producers have as part of EPR to also mitigate pollution during the consumption phase, for instance, to better incentivize sustainable design. So also focus on the design stage, but also to see how EPR can address some of those geographic leakage issues that are currently emerging, and that's in particularly with regards to second-hand exports with products that are subject to an EPR in one country, but then are exported as a used good to another country, and thus becoming end of life there, and therefore also falling outside of the responsibility of the PROs in the domestic market. So those are some of the issues that are currently being discussed, and all of these issues are case studies in this report that we have recently brought out. In this presentation, I'm only giving you a brief teaser because we have really only limited time, but each of these will have case studies in the report that you can look up and read in more detail. Next slide. So just briefly on textiles. Textiles is a pretty large waste stream that for now only has very low recovery rates. We have looked into some examples of EPR schemes that are already emerging and in place. For instance, in France, there's one for clothing, in the US and Belgium for mattresses, and in California, there's one for carpets. And these have contributed to recover and to fund some of the costs of the separate collection of these waste streams. In France, it has contributed to 21.8 million euro funding for collection, and in California, this EPR scheme funds $23 million for the collection. So whilst this has led to funding to build up collection infrastructure, it has also resulted in increased collection rates. The recycling of this collected material is still relatively low. So the challenge for EPR for textiles is that it can increase collection, but it has so far only insufficiently led to also an increase in variable recycling of the materials. Next slide, please. So, well, this is something I've already referred to in my previous slide, but EPR has traditionally only focused on the end of life and only focused on increasing recycling. And there's increased policy interest to design EPR in a way that it also includes other impacts across the life cycle and to also make producers responsible for them. So EPR can, in that sense, aim to address the direct reduction of impacts of a product, the indirect reduction of impacts. So that's also encouraging favorable product characteristics such as sustainable design. And it can also address some of the geographic aspects that and leakage aspects that I mentioned. Next slide, please. So one of the case studies in terms of the additional impacts across the life cycle that we look at is the impact of littering. So littering, and we look at that in particularly in the case of tobacco product filters, because this is something that is now emerging in the EU. There is interest to include littering impacts in EPR and to make producers responsible for the cleanup of littered products. When you look at tobacco product filters, there's some examples already in San Francisco, as I said, in the EU SUP directive, and also some voluntary schemes in Canada and United States. And what you see is that those schemes, they're essentially like advanced disposal fees. So producers pay a fee, and this fund goes into the public cleaning fund and contributes to the cleanup activities. And what you see is that San Francisco, through its scheme, has managed to raise 5 million of its 24 million costs for litter management. So it has positively and effectively contributed to the cleanup. But there's some challenges in when you look into the more details of how to design and how to best address the externality to the producer. So one of the questions is, for instance, how to fairly split the bill of cleanup across the different products that are part of a littering scheme. So to avoid that tobacco product filter, so tobacco industries are covering the littering externality of other products and thus also paying for the cleanup of other products that are being littered. So how to cross the bill. There's also a discussion around is EPR the best model to address this littering, or should it be should this externality be addressed through another policy? Next slide, please. So overall, what we see in the paper is that EPR is a promising approach to also address two additional product groups, and there's early adopters that are testing the boundaries, so that are exploring at the moment on how EPR can be applied to additional product groups as well as to additional impacts throughout the life cycle. There is evidence that EPR and those first movers that we've analyzed have shown that EPR can lead to increased collection and recovery rates, and can also help to reduce the fiscal burden of the public sector in terms of waste management. So there is rationale to increase the use of EPR to additional product groups. However, there are important remaining questions when you design EPR products, and this is how to best create sufficient design incentives without having arbitrariness in the EPR fees, how to assign responsibility in the context of international value chains and transboundary movements of waste. Also, there's a question around like, where do producers have agency to act? So where does EPR make sense to then also incentivize that producers act and, for instance, change their product designs or change their activities? And also a question that we continue to be working on is, are EPR fees passed on to households, and what kind of distribution impacts would that potentially lead to? So specialized expertise remains a driver for extended producer responsibility, but there are important policy questions that need to be addressed and considered when applying EPR to new product groups. I believe this was my last slide, and yeah, with that, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fritz, for this presentation and the appetizer. And I'm happy to dive into the discussion now with two discussants I would like to invite on stage. And for all the participants, please feel free to write your questions or comments in the chat. We're opening the discussion now with Daisy Meng. She's the North America Policy Institution Senior Manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a nonprofit organization that creates evidence-based original research on the benefits of a circular economy and how it can contribute to solving global challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. Daisy is responsible for the foundation's policy work in North America. And I'd also like to introduce you to David Allaway. He has worked at the intersection of waste, materials, and environment for over 30 years. He is currently a senior policy analyst at the Department of Environmental Quality in the US state of Oregon, where his work applies research into the environmental impacts of materials across their life cycle to inform and develop policies addressing climate and product stewardship. So a warm welcome to both of you, Daisy and David. And with that, I'd like to open the discussion, and I'm very happy to receive your reaction and comments to the two presentations. Daisy, would you like to go first?
Sure, great. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation works to identify key levers to accelerate the transition towards a circular economy. And in our work, we have identified EPR and in particular mandatory fee-based EPR as a necessary part of the solution to build a system based on a circular economy. We believe that EPR is the only proven pathway to ensure the dedicated, ongoing, and sufficient funding necessary to address market failures and cover the existing net cost to scale solutions and support the transition to a circular economy. As we've just heard, EPR has proven to be a successful policy tool in many ways. However, despite being necessary and often successful, EPR schemes are by themselves not enough to address waste and pollution arising from packaging, textiles, and other products. As we've heard, again, EPR needs to be part of a broader policy strategy to scale the circular economy. And it is important that while we discuss how to improve EPR schemes, we also consider how to best integrate such schemes in with other policies. In order to chart the future of EPR, we need to understand what has and has not worked in the existing landscape. EMF's EPR experience to date focuses mainly on packaging and textiles, so I wanted to highlight a few insights that we've developed that may be relevant to the discussion. First, in the packaging space, from the Global Commitment Program that we run in collaboration with UNEP, we now have 5 years of data on how businesses are performing against their packaging-related targets. And one of the 3 pivotal hurdles we've identified where even industry leaders have made limited progress in the last 5 years is the scaling up of reuse business models. And in parallel, we've just released a new study focused on reusable packaging, where we found that returnable packaging has the potential to offer significant environmental benefits and can compete economically with single-use plastics, especially when you account for externalities. But at the same time, the design of packaging across companies needs greater harmonization to be even more cost-effective. This work on packaging has helped us understand that we need to foster the right enabling conditions from a policy perspective. This should indeed include setting up and expanding EPR systems to include, for example, time-bound reuse targets, and also reviewing competition policy to promote collaboration. Now, from our work in the textile space, we see that all over the world, separate collection for textiles tends to be voluntary and fragmented if it exists at all. Existing systems all focus on clothing that is deemed rewearable, as this is where revenues are made. There's currently kind of no viable business case to separately collect and process all clothing waste beyond what is reusable. So voluntary schemes and individual company initiatives will not suffice to bridge the funding gap, and we need a collective system and infrastructure to capture the value of used clothing. Against this backdrop, EPR has seen increased political momentum, in particular in the EU, where the European Commission has proposed to make EPR for textiles mandatory across the bloc, but also in places like the US, where this conversation is starting to pick up. Of course, we still need to solve problems like the question of geographic scope for where EPR products are exported. In all of that context, we welcome today's discussion on the potential to expand EPR scope to new aspects and sectors and features, because based on today's challenges, it's apparent that we need to go beyond current policy. The conversation that we see emerging, exemplified by these 2 papers, is extremely valuable as it seeks to uncover the opportunity to rethink EPR and maximize its potential contribution to a system change from a linear to a circular economy. I'd like to comment on a few specific aspects of the 2 presented papers. First, on the Zero Waste Scotland paper, we see that you're highlighting the need for a virgin reduction target, and we've seen in our experience that a reduction target itself may not be enough to achieve actual reduction. We need to better understand and perhaps further discuss the necessary levers in line with the circular economy principles to achieve an overall reduction to enable producers to actually meet their reduction targets. For instance, the implementation of refill and reuse models can help achieve virgin reduction. So we need to consider how they can be enabled by EPR policies are embedded into EPR policies alongside reduction targets, and what other interventions can complement reuse targets to help scale reuse business models. The OECD paper highlights that EPR has already been implemented across many different sectors and strengthens the evidence that EPR policies, even if they can be improved, are at present working and achieving some of the expected outcomes. This analysis offers a starting point for us to look at other sectors' experiences and learn from the successes and failures to improve EPR schemes for other applications. It also reinforces the need to open up the discussion to new sectors and to include additional features. Nonetheless, expanding EPR to include innovative features might come with additional complexity. How should we avoid or at least mitigate that complexity? And when we think about EPR being most often implemented at the national or subnational level, with a growing number of EPR schemes across geographies and sectors, how can we make sure that we're fostering information exchange, increasing harmonization, and again, limiting complexity? So that is all I have to say, and I will go ahead and pass it to David.
Thank you so much, Daisy. David, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Angelina, Daisy, Jamie, and Frijaf. Great presentations all. So I just read both of these papers in the last 24 hours. So I'm going to speak very extemporaneously here. I regret that I did not read the papers sooner. I highly recommend both papers to everyone on this call. I think they both make very important contributions to this topic. I was especially inspired by the very compelling way in which Jamie's paper really very succinctly drew out the connection between overconsumption in the global north with the linked polycrises of climate, pollution, biodiversity loss, and social inequities. A couple of common themes, I think, in both papers. First is that recycling, if done well, can be helpful, but it is inadequate. It is insufficient. And this is an important message that we've been communicating for the last 15 years, and delighted to find folks across the pond in Europe now saying the same thing. And by extension, then, EPR, which focuses only on expanding recycling, is missing its full potential. And I think both papers, again, make very important contributions in suggesting the need for policy innovation. The OECD paper provides some compelling case studies of efforts to innovate around EPR, both in terms of expanding in material directions and also scope. I think the Zero Waste Scotland paper makes an important contribution in suggesting some specific policy options. The idea of reducing material throughput, I think, is compelling as a goal, and is much, as Jamie said, provides more flexibility to producers in the spirit of EPR, and is more closely aligned to the overarching objective of reducing environmental impacts. It does a better job, it provides a clearer signal than simply increasing recycling rates, which again is inadequate. At the same time, not all materials are equal. Not all materials are the same with regard to their environmental impacts. And there is the potential to increase environmental impacts as a consequence of reducing material throughput in some cases. So I would like to see some guardrails here, that we never lose sight of what should be the ultimate objective, which is to achieve a state of sustainability, which I would define as a state where all people's needs are met, and globally, the level at which we extract resources from the environment is at a level which can be sustained in perpetuity, and the level in which we emit pollution back into the environment is within a limit that the environment can absorb and metabolize safely in perpetuity. And those are the most important guardrails we need. On the spirit of policy innovation, I did want to mention for a minute here a law recently passed in my home state, which I think demonstrates some policy innovation, as both papers suggest. It's our Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. On the surface, it is packaging EPR, but it has several innovations I think are very important. First, in terms of goals and approach, it focuses as much on quality of outcomes as quantity. It is not about achieving recycling targets, but rather improving environmental outcomes through improving how recycling is performed. By advancing recycling where recycling makes environmental sense and not advancing it where it does not, by ensuring that materials collected in this state for recycling go to responsible end markets, as many of the materials from the Western US are exported, causing social and environmental harm in the global South, and explicitly addressing objectives of social equity. Our law also has two upstream innovations. The first is a very significant fund that is dedicated to reducing the environmental impacts of covered products through means other than recycling. And this could fund, for example, industrial decarbonization efforts, pollution prevention, the expansion of reuse infrastructure, waste prevention, and et cetera. And finally, because collectively we manage what we measure, our law requires the development of standards for the assessment of environmental impacts across the life cycle, and it creates financial incentives and mandates for producers to evaluate and publicly disclose environmental impacts in alignment with those standards. So those are two additional areas of policy innovation that are happening in our part of the world. There's so much opportunity here. And again, I really applaud both organizations and their co-sponsors for their important work in advancing this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David and Daisy, for your reactions, for your comments, and also for sharing further information like the reuse study of Ellen MacArthur Foundation and this new law from the state of Oregon. Very interesting. Before I open the floor to the other participants, Jamie or Fritz, would you like to react on the statements that were just made?
Yes, I'm happy to, and thank you for the comments, both from David and from Daisy. Much appreciated. I think the only direct response that I think is probably worth making just now is to one of Daisy's points around the reduction target itself not usually being enough. We agree. It's why we keep emphasising this policy mix that's required, and it's also one of the justifications for suggesting that there has to be some mechanism of bringing in the true cost of goods as well. So if you just do the reduction target and people fail to hit it, then current penalties might be relatively small, and therefore from a producer perspective, they're happy just to pay the fine. Trying to bring more of those externalities onto the balance sheet makes the potential scale of the penalty that bit bigger. That's not to say that the paper includes all the permutations that can work with it, but it's a big part of the rationale for having the true cost and the reduction target sitting together. But yeah, I mean, even within EPR schemes, as we're implementing just now, we're seeing that move towards proportional reuse. We're seeing that move towards recycle content, etc. So we are starting to see that within modulation. We're just really keen to explore stuff that might do it a little bit faster and go a bit further. But it's really interesting to hear David's example as well around the policy measures that are being implemented in the States and bringing together that policy mix to try, again, one tool isn't going to solve this, but being able to hit different points along the supply chain and place different responsibilities. And none of that takes away from the broader point around product stewardship, where there is an obligation on different points of the supply chain to be able to act here as well. But we're obviously talking about leveraging the greatest, where we can achieve the greatest impact, which sits with the producers usually. So thank you both for your comments. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jamie. Fritz, anything to add here?
Yes, I have something to add, and then also my colleague Andrew wanted to intervene after me briefly. I mean, just one thing. I mean, what this webinar is talking about and what those two papers talk about is really the cutting edge of EPR. So this is really, as David says, kind of the policy innovation of how can we make EPR as what it currently is even better? How can we address the externalities of products even better, internalize them better? How can we enlarge EPR to additional product groups? So just being mindful also the people who are on this call, possibly also from emerging economies where EPR is only just starting up. I wanted to just refer back to what Daisy said, that all of those considerations that we're talking about also increase complexity, of course. So when starting up an EPR from the start, it might be worth to start it up relatively basic and simple, and then only introduce some of those aspects that we're talking about here at a second stage to just have a first EPR system that runs, and then further complexify it, further go into the details of the different externalities that can be addressed. So this is just something I wanted to put out there for maybe some listeners from Latin America that might also be on the call. Yes, with that, I maybe just pass it to Andrew briefly.
All right, I think my microphone is now no longer muted. So yeah, just to give a little bit of a background about the genesis of the report. The OECD, we were having a conversation with external partners from an industry group, and we were talking about the responsibility for littering of products. And this, I think everyone on the call had a different reaction about responsibility for this, and that this sparked the need to try to have a conversation about what has been successful for EPR, where are maybe the limits, and exploring that cutting edge, as Fritz has called it. So this was an opportunity to step back from saying what are the most technical changes in what we can do to an EPR policy to maximize recycling rates, step back and say, what are we trying to achieve here with the circular economy? Where does EPR fit in within this? Where are maybe the limits? Where are the complementary policies that can help to achieve what we want overall? So taking more of a design perspective and applying it to policy making. So with that, I'll leave my intervention.
Thank you so much, all. I see there are some comments and questions in the chat. The first one by Tone. It's a comment regarding responsibility of the shipped products for secondary use and durability. Tone, would you like to take the mic, or shall I read out your comment?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. No, my comment was related to that I think when Jamie was speaking, he was speaking mainly about duration of service and expanding the duration of service, and that is the main thing that of course the EU is concerned about, is prolonging the duration of service of products. And if we could implement in different product groups, for example, in textiles and footwear, that it was mandated that there was a date on the product when it goes to market, so that when you do the waste audits, which also the EU is going to implement as part of the EPR scheme, is mandating waste audits, you can actually see in the waste audits how long the products have served, and if they, and also evaluate if they're actually used up when they go into the different waste streams. You can also capture the products that come from internet sales, and you can also do the waste audits in the global south and other countries where these products end up as sadly more waste than being used as secondary products. And the OR Foundation has actually started doing this type of waste audits to see which brands and if they can identify in some way how long they've been in service, because already some companies have codes on the products that say when they go to the market. So that was part of my thing, is that we in Norway, we've been developing an idea called targeted producer responsibility, which is actually using waste audits as a way. So you're looking at the waste phase instead of the design phase to establish duration of service.
Well, Mary, you have a wonderful walk.
Thanks so much for sharing, Tone. Very interesting. Sharing this best practice. Maybe if you have some links to follow up, that would be interesting. If you could put that in the chat. Is there anyone from our speakers or discussants who want to react to this contribution? Okay, otherwise I see that there's another question by Reed. In some circumstances, reuse and increased durability do not lead to net environmental benefits. For example, the purchase of secondhand goods that doesn't replace primary goods. Are there EPR policies or programs that address this issue? Yes, David, please.
Actually, not that I'm aware of, but there should be, and that's why I made this point around the need to have guardrails that point to higher order environmental outcomes. So, for example, in Oregon's packaging law, where there is this fund, so consistent with the principles of EPR, most of the activity, most of the funding of programs, et cetera, in our law on the recycling side is performed by the producer or sort of the producer responsibility organizations. But when it comes to reuse, the money flows to the state, and the state directs the use of the reuse fund. And one of the reasons for this is because we've seen examples where producers will advance or propose reuse models which don't necessarily reduce environmental impacts, even if they lead to more reuse. The textbook example of this is the loop system in North America, which profiled this beautiful brushed steel insulated container for an ice cream brand. And I mean, just given what I know about life cycle impacts, unless that solid steel, container was reused many, many times and captured at a very, very high rate, it's quite unlikely that the environmental impacts of it would be lower than single-use poly-coated ice cream containers sent to landfill, right? So our law directs us not to achieve reuse targets. It directs us to fund reuse projects that reduce environmental impacts. So the overarching objective is to reduce environmental impacts, and that is the metric against which we have to evaluate potential projects and report our successes. So it's very important to align the higher order goal, which is reduction of impacts, with the policy mechanism itself.
Great, thanks, David. I think Fritz wants to add here, and then unfortunately we have to wrap up already. Please, Fritz.
Yeah, just really briefly to add to this. I mean, it's very much aligned with what David said. Reed's comment or question takes for granted that every EPR goal strives towards increased reuse or increased durability. But I think you always need to take a step back and really ask, what is actually the ultimate goal of an EPR? And the ultimate goal in the end is to place responsibility onto the producer so that there's an incentive for the producer to act. So in a way, the polluter pays principle. And the other one, to reduce environmental impact of the products across the life cycle. So only if reuse or durability achieves a reduction in environmental impacts, then of course it makes sense. But reuse in itself is not the goal. So of course you really need to look product by product, and then also within the products to see where does reuse lead to environmental benefits, and then it can be a criteria or goal for an EPR. But it shouldn't be a goal in the first place for all products to reuse, only where it's environmentally beneficial. And there's some good examples that Reed listed here where it would not be environmentally beneficial.
Great, thank you so much. with this, I would like to close this meeting, although I know there are some unanswered questions. I'm sorry, I hope we can take them up the next time. I would like to thank you all for participating, and especially I would like to thank all the speakers, Jamie, Fritz, also Andrew, and our discussants, Daisy and David, for joining, and yeah, for this fruitful conversation. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you all soon in our next webinars. Have a good day, everyone, and take care. Bye-bye.